All right, let's try a little thought experiment. Picture it. It's 1890.
Okay.
You're walking to work, you trip on a busted sidewalk and snap your legs broken. Or say you grab a meat pie for lunch and an hour later you realize it was mostly sawdust and spoiled pork.
Not a great day.
A terrible day. Or maybe the economy tanks, your boss just locks the factory gates. Now you're out of a job, you're injured, maybe poisoned. You go to the government for help. What happens?
In 1890, nothing. The government effectively looks at you and says, not our problem.
That's it. Just tough luck.
Pretty much. You could ask a neighbor for help, maybe a church charity, but the federal government, no. They are not coming to save you.
Okay, now flip the calendar forward. It's 1919. Less than 30 years later. Same scenarios. What happens now?
Well, now the government is suddenly everywhere. They're inspecting your lunch, they're taxing your paycheck. They might even throw you in jail if you complain too loudly about a war.
That is just a whiplash-level turnaround. We're talking a complete rewrite of the social contract in, what, one generation?
Yeah. It's what we're calling the Great Shift in U.S. domestic policy. We go from a government that's basically a passive referee.
We're not even on the field.
We're just a spectator, exactly. To one that's an active, even aggressive manager of American life.
So that's our deep dive for today. We've got a pile of sources here to figure out how the U.S. went from this sort of economic Wild West to the era of regulation, prohibition, and the IRS.
And to get there, we really have to start at the beginning. We need to talk about the Gilded Age.
Right, which is such a great name. Mark Twain coined it, and it sounds so glamorous. But it's really an insult, isn't it?
It is. If something is gilded, it's just covered in a paper-thin layer of gold. It looks shiny and valuable, but you scratch the surface.
And it's rotting wood underneath.
Exactly. The gold was that huge industrial boom. The Carnegies, the Rockefellers, all the railroads. The rotting wood was, well, the reality for the millions of people actually fueling that boom.
It's a huge paradox.
It is. Because on one hand, the standard of living was, technically, rising. Mass production meant you could buy clothes and tools cheaper than ever. Andrew Carnegie even wrote that famous essay, The Gospel of Wealth.
Right.
Arguing that, this inequality was worth it because a poor person in his day could afford things that kings couldn't a century before.
Which sounds nice, I guess. Unless you're the one working 16 hours a day in a factory to make those cheap things.
Precisely. The whole philosophy was laissez-faire.
Let it be.
Let it be. The government keeps its hands off. No minimum wage, no safety rules, and certainly no income tax.
And the justification for all this was something called social Darwinism, which just sounds brutal.
It was. It was taking Darwin's survival of the fittest and just applying it to society. Thinkers at the time argued that millionaires were rich because they were naturally the fittest, the most superior.
So if you were poor,
it wasn't the system's fault, it was because you were unfit. It framed poverty as a personal, moral, or even biological failing.
So if I'm starving on the street, that's not a social problem, it's just nature taking its course.
That was the logic. And it gave the government the perfect excuse to do nothing.
But the numbers in our sources here are just staggering. Child labor tripled between 1870 and 1900.
It was everywhere. 6-year-olds working night shifts in glass factories, breathing in dust, losing fingers. And if you got hurt on the job, like our broken leg example, no workers' comp. You were just fired and replaced. People were treated like disposable machine parts.
Okay, so how do you break a mindset like that? How do you convince an entire country that maybe, just maybe, the game is rigged?
You have to show them the rot under the gold. And this is where the muckrakers come in.
The investigative journalists.
Right. It was actually Teddy Roosevelt who gave them that name, and it wasn't a compliment. He said they were so busy raking the muck on the floor they couldn't see the sky.
But they kind of wore it like a badge of honor.
They did. People like Jacob Riis, the photographer, he went into the tenements in New York with this new flash photography.
Right. How the other half lives.
Yes. And it forced the comfortable middle class to actually see the squalor. You can ignore a statistic about poverty, but you can't ignore a photograph of 3 kids sleeping in a filthy alleyway.
And then there's Upton Sinclair. I feel like everyone knows about his book, The Jungle, but they get the whole point of it wrong.
Oh, it's the classic example of unintended consequences. Sinclair was a socialist. He wanted to write a book that would break America's heart about the plight of immigrant workers.
He was focused on the people.
Completely. The exploitation, the injuries, the horrible conditions. But nobody cared about the workers.
They cared about what was in their food.
They cared about the part where he describes rats being poisoned and then shoveled into the same meat grinders as the rest of the meat. He aimed for America's heart.
And hit it square in the stomach.
Exactly. The public outcry wasn't save the workers, it was, oh my God, what's in my sausage? But hey, it worked. It forced the government's hand.
But it wasn't just the writers. Right. The workers themselves were fighting back. But it seems like the early labor movements really struggled.
It was a tough road. You had groups like the Knights of Labor, who were these idealists. They wanted one big union, skilled, unskilled, women, black workers, everyone together.
Strength in numbers.
In theory. But then you had the AFL, the American Federation of Labor. They were much more pragmatic.
And exclusive.
Very. They basically said, forget saving the world, let's just get better wages and hours for skilled white men. But the bigger problem is that every time they went on strike, it seemed to end in violence. And the newspapers would paint them all as dangerous anarchists.
So public opinion wasn't on their side yet.
Not really. Not until the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire in 1911.
This event feels like a real turning point.
It was a nightmare. 146 workers died, most of them young immigrant women. The factory owners had locked the stairwell doors
To keep them from taking breaks, right?
to keep them from taking unauthorized breaks or stealing scraps of fabric. When the fire broke out, they were trapped. People on the street below literally watched women jump from the 9th floor windows.
Just horrible.
It completely shattered the whole laissez-faire argument. You couldn't say, the market will protect workers. The market locked the doors. It proved that without government intervention, some businesses would literally sacrifice human lives for profit.
So you've got all this pressure building up, the photos, the bad meat, this horrible fire, but you need a politician to actually do something. And then, by a complete fluke, the reformers get their guy, Theodore Roosevelt.
A total accident. The Republican Party bosses, they could not stand him. He was a loose cannon, way too progressive. Their plan was to bury him in the vice presidency.
Which was seen as a dead-end job.
A political graveyard. And then, in 1901, President McKinley is assassinated.
And suddenly, that damned cowboy, as they called him, is the President of the United States.
Right, and he comes in with his square deal.
Let's clarify that, because deal sounds like he's giving something away.
And he was very clear it wasn't a handout. The square deal wasn't about guaranteeing success. It was about guaranteeing a fair game, that the cards aren't stacked against you from the start, a level playing field.
So how does he do that?
He starts swinging a club. He takes the old Sherman Antitrust Act and actually uses it to break up monopolies, what he called the bad trusts. And then, riding that wave of disgust from the jungle, he pushes through the Meat Inspection Act and the Pure Food and Drug Act.
And that's huge. That's the government saying, for the first time, we have the right to walk into your private business and check your product.
A fundamental shift. And he does the same thing with nature. He was a huge conservationist. He creates the U.S. Forest Service, not just to preserve beauty, but to manage the resources efficiently, to stop companies from just clear-cutting everything.
Okay, so TR really changes the whole mood. But then he's out of office, Taft comes in, and then we get to the election of 1912, which is just a mess. How does Woodrow Wilson, a Democrat, even win?
We only get Wilson because of TR's massive ego. He came back, decided he didn't like what Taft was doing, and he tried to take the Republican nomination back.
And they said no.
They said no. So he stormed off and started his own party, the Progressive Party, the Bull Moose Party.
So you've got Taft the Republican, TR the Progressive, and Wilson the Democrat all running.
And Eugene Debs, the socialist, who pulls almost 1 million votes. It's a four-way race. TR and Taft split the conservative vote right down the middle, and Woodrow Wilson just strolls into the White House.
And he brings a whole different, more academic style of reform.
Exactly. And this is where we get the really big foundational changes, the stuff that still affects us every single day.
The 16th Amendment.
The federal income tax.
Before this, the government mostly ran on tariffs, right? Taxes on imported goods. Why the change?
Wilson wanted to lower those tariffs to make goods cheaper for regular people, but the government still needs money. So the income tax was the replacement.
And I know people listening are groaning.
Of course. But you have to remember, when it started in 1913, it was tiny. It only applied to the richest few percent of Americans. If you were a regular worker, you paid nothing.
Zero.
Zero. And even for the rich, the rates were like 1 to 7%. But it established the principle. Once the mechanism is in place, you can always turn up the pressure later.
Speaking of mechanisms, he also creates the Federal Reserve. This is another one that makes people's eyes glaze over, but it's a huge deal.
It's massive. Think of the 19th century economy like a car with no suspension. Every few years, there'd be a financial panic, banks would fail, and ordinary people would lose their life savings. The Fed was designed to be the shock absorber, a central bank that could manage the money supply and stop those catastrophic collapses.
So by 1916, the shift is pretty undeniable. But then, 1917, World War I.
The war is the accelerator. It takes every single one of these progressive ideas about government management and efficiency and just cranks the dial to 11.
Because you can't run a modern war with a hands-off approach.
It's impossible. You need steel for ships, you need food for soldiers, you need coal for factories. You can't just hope the free market provides it on time, so the government basically takes over the whole economy.
Through things like the War Industries Board.
Right, run by a guy named Bernard Baruch. He could literally tell a car factory, stop making cars, start making tanks. And they had to do it. The government even took over the railroads to make sure supplies and troops moved efficiently.
And it wasn't just the big industries. It came right down to the dinner table, didn't it?
Oh, completely. Herbert Hoover ran the Food Administration. He was brilliant. He used propaganda and social pressure instead of forced rationing. Meatless Mondays, wheatless Wednesdays.
It wasn't the law,
But if your neighbors saw you grilling a steak on a Monday, you were basically seen as a traitor. It was an incredibly effective way to manage consumption.
And what about the unions? The workers?
They got a deal. The government couldn't afford strikes during the war, so the National War Labor Board made a bargain. You promise not to strike, and we will guarantee the 8-hour day and your right to organize.
So the government finally sides with labor.
But only because they needed the bullets and the bombs, and it worked. Union membership exploded, but all of this control had a really dark side.
The social paradox.
Yeah. We were fighting a war to make the world safe for democracy, but back home, democracy was being put on hold.
You're talking about the Espionage and Sedition Acts.
It became a crime to say anything disloyal about the government, the flag, the war effort.
A crime to say something. What about free speech?
The Supreme Court basically said, not during a war. In the case Schenck v. United States, Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes used the famous analogy. You can't falsely shout, "Fire!" in a crowded theater. He argued that if speech presents a clear and present danger to the country, it can be punished.
But who decides what a danger is? A pamphlet urging people to resist the draft. Is that really fire?
That's the terrifying question, isn't it? The government decided that dissent was the danger. People were arrested for criticizing the Red Cross. German music was banned. It was an atmosphere of total paranoia.
And this need for control and moral purity led directly to prohibition.
The 18th Amendment. It was the perfect storm. You had the anti-alcohol crusaders, plus the need to save grain for the war effort, and the fact that most of the big brewers were German-American. Drinking beer became unpatriotic.
So no beer. But at the same time, women finally get the right to vote.
The 19th Amendment, again, the war was the key. How could you ask women to work in munitions factories and drive ambulances to save democracy, and then turn around and tell them they weren't fit to participate in it? The hypocrisy became impossible to defend.
So we get to 1919. The war is over. We should be celebrating, right?
Yeah.
But the sources paint 1919 as just an awful year.
It was pure chaos. The Great Shift hit a wall. First, the Spanish flu pandemic kills more Americans than the war did, 675,000 people.
And the economy goes haywire.
The government lifts all those wartime price controls overnight. Inflation just skyrockets.
Yeah.
And that promise not to strike.
The deal is off.
The deal is off. And workers are furious. 4 million Americans went on strike in 1919. 1 out of every 5 workers. It was mayhem.
And how did this new, powerful government respond to the chaos?
With panic. They saw the strikes, they saw the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia, and they thought a communist takeover was imminent. This was the Red Scare. Raids, deportations, mass arrests.
And on top of all that, there was horrific racial violence.
The Red Summer. White mobs attacking black neighborhoods across the country. The entire social fabric felt like it was ripping apart. It was a violent, ugly end to this whole era.
Okay, let's try to synthesize this. We start in 1890 with a government that does almost nothing. We end in 1919 with a government that manages industries, taxes income, controls speech, and bans alcohol.
The goal of the progressives was always order and efficiency. They looked at the chaos and corruption of the Gilded Age and truly believed they could use scientific principles and government power to fix it, to manage society.
And in some ways, they succeeded. I mean, I'm glad my food is inspected.
Absolutely. They built the foundations of the modern regulatory state. But the big lesson from this period is that the power you grant the government to inspect your meat can also be used to inspect your ideas.
And that brings us to the final, really chilling thought from our source material. This idea of scientific management wasn't just for forests and factories.
No. The final thing they wanted to manage was the people themselves.
If you believe you can scientifically perfect a society, it's a short leap to deciding that some of the citizens are defective parts.
It is the great tragedy of the progressive movement. The same impulse for efficiency that helped end child labor also fueled the eugenics movement. Many of these same reformers believed that to have a healthy society, you had to stop the unfit, the poor, the disabled, the immigrants from reproducing.
It's just a stark reminder that progress is never simple. When we ask the government to step in and fix things, we have to be incredibly careful about who gets to decide what and who needs fixing.
A sobering but essential lesson.
That's all for this deep dive. Thanks for listening. We'll catch you on the next one.